Over the last few weeks, we've been looking at the final physical week of Jesus' life. He spends this last week around Jerusalem, which that was not his normal place to be. And on Sunday, we found him coming into Jerusalem, that triumphant entry where he is coronated as the king of the Jews. We looked at Monday, and we found how that Jesus curses a fig tree early in the morning. He goes and cleanses the temple. So there's some people that have some questions, and they are brought to him, and he does some teaching. And we also found that the voice of God, again, booms out his adoration and acceptance of his Son. We then looked at Tuesday. Tuesday morning, that fig tree is withered. Jesus returns to the temple, and the very first thing that happens is he's approached by the leaders, and they question what authority he has to be doing the things he's doing. Obviously, he's upset things yesterday, and now then they're questioning him about that. Jesus responds with 3 parables all about them, about how the leadership of Judaism has departed from God's desire. Then there are 3 folks that step up, 3 groups, I guess, that step up, and they have questions designed to trick Jesus, and they put those out, and Jesus answers each of them just phenomenally. They are basically put to silence because of the way in which he answers those questions. Then it's Jesus' turn, and he asks a question about David, and about David calling his Lord, Lord, indicating the son of David is also going to be the Son of God. And that's the claim that you're making me guilty of, making myself God. But that's what the prophecy has said. And then we looked last week at those Matthew chapter 23 and the woes that Jesus pronounces upon the hypocrisy of the Jewish leadership. Very, very pointed lessons that Jesus gives to them. We're still in Tuesday. Tuesday was jam-packed. But now what's going to happen is Jesus and the disciples prepare to leave the temple area, and as they do, the disciples are going to make a comment. Some of his disciples were remarking about how the temple was adorned with beautiful stones, with gifts dedicated to God. But Jesus said, "As for what you see here, the time will come when not one stone will be left on another. Every one of them will be thrown down." Jesus says that. They depart. They're headed for the Mount of Olives. I think it's Bill O'Reilly in his book on Killing Jesus comments about how at Passover time the hills would be littered with campsites. In other words, people came to observe the Passover. There was not lodging for all those folks, and so they would be camped around the city of Jerusalem. And his comment is that Jesus and the disciples go to the Mount of Olives. They may have a fire going there. They're just sitting around talking with each other. And Jesus is going to be questioned about his comment concerning the temple, and the disciples are going to ask that. Mark chapter 13 indicates that it began, at least as a private conversation between Peter, James, John, and Andrew and Jesus. In other words, they're the ones that present the question. But it appears that it broadens into including the whole group of disciples that are with Jesus in this evening time, if you will. And they questioned him, saying, "Teacher, when therefore will these things be, and what will be the signs when these things are about to take place?" In other words, they've contemplated this tearing down of the temple. When's that supposed to happen? The disciples' question in Mark and Luke relates to the timing of the destruction of the temple. Matthew includes a question about the end of time. Now, this is not a hard and fast thing, but that may provide an indication that the disciples did not perceive that the temple was going to be destroyed until the end of time. In other words, in their mind, they were just asking one question. In Jesus' mind, they've asked 2 questions. And so we have undertook in previous times to try to look at those texts and to exegete, what part of which is answering which question. And we're not going to delve into any of that. That's a study for the past and the future, but not for today. Simply know that Jesus is answering the question about the destruction of the temple and about the end of time. And the disciples may not have had as much understanding of the answers as we currently do. So he offers them information about the destruction of the Jerusalem, and we recognize historically that happened in 70 A.D., but he also gives answers to the question regarding the end of time, which from our vantage point is still sometime in the future. Now, I think a little bit of history in regard to the destruction of Jerusalem will be appropriate as we consider how accurate and prophetic Jesus is at this moment in time. It will hopefully validate his discussion of the end to us. Jesus clearly outlines events that were slated to take place about 40 years after he leaves this world, which is in and of itself unusual. Here's the Cliff Note version. We know that the Jews were always in turmoil with Rome. I mean, even in the time of Christ, things were not kosher between them. There was this built-in tension. Well, that continues to escalate after the death of Christ. And what began to develop is when the Roman official who was in charge of the revenue of this area, whenever he thought the Jews weren't paying enough tax to Caesar, he would just go to Jerusalem, enter the temple, and steal. He would just take the silver and the gold that he wanted to give to Caesar. Now, that went on for a number of years, and again, you can just imagine and sense how that would have disrupted the Jewish heart. Enter into our sacred place and take that money. Jewish violence, however, did not really begin to become prominent until around 50 A.D., and it turned into a full-blown revolt by 66 A.D. Roman troops came in at that time and attempted to squelch this thing, to put it under, to downplay it. And what they did is they entered in Jerusalem and they killed 3,600 Jerusalem citizens. Now again, that's about our World Trade Center disaster. So you can imagine one city being devastated with that kind of activity from Rome. They thought this should settle things down. Well, it did not. As a matter of fact, it just kind of stirred things up. There was a group of Jews who developed guerrilla war tactics. As a matter of fact, some authors call them Jewish terrorists. And they developed the guerrilla tactic of devising small daggers that they would hide in the arms, under the arms of their cloaks. And they would just walk up to someone in a crowded city area, walk up to a Roman soldier and just stab him and kill him, and the knife would be back under their sleeve, and they'd walk away. So it was those kinds of things that the Jews now begin to institute against Rome. As a matter of fact, that was the way Masada, the Roman fortress, was taken over by the Jews. It was not an out-and-out battle. It was a ruse where these terrorists went into the fortress and killed the soldiers. And all of a sudden, the Jews took this Roman fortress away. They slaughtered all of the Roman soldiers. Now that's Masada. That we recognize later, that becomes the place where the Jews hide out when the Romans are attempting to annihilate them. Okay, the revolt grows. The Roman governor sent 20,000 troops, and he held Jerusalem under hostage for 6 months. The Jews, however, rallied. They actually counterattacked this group and killed 6,000 Roman soldiers and ran them off. Now, what they did then is they confiscated all that weaponry, and that just made the Jews that much stronger. And so the animosity is growing, their ability to fight is becoming more refined, and this thing is becoming bigger and bigger and bigger. Nero finds that now he has to step in. Things are getting out of hand, and so it's gone all the way up to the emperor of Rome, and he sends down a general, Vespasian, and he comes for Nero to settle this thing with the Jews. He enters into, and by fairly quickly, he's able to settle things in the northern region, but all of a sudden Nero dies. He returns to Rome to become emperor, and Titus, his son, is left in charge of putting down this Jewish revolt. Titus surrounds Jerusalem, and he begins systematically to squeeze the life out of it. Starvation takes many lives. One of the things, again, that Mr. O'Reilly mentions in his book is that they were around the city for such a long period of time that the Passover came, and they actually allowed these Jews to enter into Jerusalem to observe the Passover, but then they wouldn't let them out. So again, you can just see this thing becomes just a death trap for all the Jews. They're coming for Passover, they're in the city, now they can't get out. He also discusses how that anybody who tried to escape, the Roman soldiers just set up crucifixion stations all around the city of Jerusalem, and anybody that tried to escape, they would crucify him. And he claims that they ran out of wood, and they had to start traveling miles to get the wood to build enough crosses to kill all of these Jews. In 70 AD, Titus is able to breach the walls of the city, and they go in and systematically they ransack the city. The annihilation is thorough and it is complete. Josephus, a historian of Jewish history, says that 1,100,000 people were killed when the Romans entered into Jerusalem, and that 97,000 were captured to be used as slaves. Here is some of Josephus's description of this event. But when they, and he's talking about the Romans, when they went in numbers into the lanes of the city with their swords drawn, they slew those whom they overtook without mercy. They set fire to the houses whither the Jews were fled, and burnt every soul in them, and laid waste a great many of the rest. They ran everyone through whom they met with, and obstructed the very lanes with their dead bodies. Human roadblocks. They built human roadblocks in the city of Jerusalem to keep people from entering into certain places in the city. He continues, and they made the whole city run down with blood to such a degree indeed that the fire of many of the houses was quenched with these men's blood. Again, I suspect there's a little literary license there, a little exaggeration, but the point is this devastation of the Jews in Jerusalem is complete, is absolute. The Romans were given instructions after the temple was set on fire to loot the temple, to take the sacred things. The Jews that were still alive, that was like the last straw. And so those people began, if you will, a fortified attack against those Roman soldiers. As, again, the mental image, the temple is burning, these soldiers are looting all that is valuable out of the temple, and the Jews are here. This is God's house, we're going to defend it. And there's not a Jew left alive. These soldiers are just ruthless. What I found absolutely amazing about this, first of all, Jesus said this was going to happen. But before the attack, Titus was a real, he was the son of a general, and he had a real military mind, a great fascination with military strength. And one of the things that he had observed in the city of Jerusalem was the great power of the towers that were a part of the wall structure, and how those towers were impenetrable. They were not able to breach those towers, and they were using catapults, they were doing all the things of that time. But the towers were remaining firm, and he was fascinated with that. And so he gave instructions before they began the attack. He said, I don't want those towers torn down. I want those towers left because I want to study and see how they were able to build these and what's so remarkable about them. Now, here's what Josephus says that Titus said concerning their battle, their victory, and the towers. We have certainly had God for our assistance in this war. And it was no other than God who ejected the Jews out of these fortifications, for what could the hands of men or any machines do towards overthrowing these towers? And you know what? That son of a Roman general who was given the responsibility to take care of Jerusalem as a secondary military leader was exactly right. It was God. It was Jesus prophesying about this that enabled this to be evident that this was a work of God. Interestingly, history does not record that there was a single Christian that died in Jerusalem as the Romans laid siege to that city. Probably they comprehended Jesus' warnings out of that 24th chapter of Matthew when they saw the desolation that they were to flee, that they were to leave. Through the decades following Jesus' crucifixion, we know that the church was strong in Jerusalem. But then it began to dissipate. And we even find the Bible talking about in Acts chapter 8 that there's this persecution that arises against the church. And that as a result of that, it says that they were scattered and that they went everywhere preaching the gospel. So the church, the Christians of Jerusalem, it's not like this was their spiritual Mecca. They were leaving. They were going. And apparently, as they saw signs going on that caused them to believe that the destruction time may be near, they left. They left. The church father Eusebius wrote about this reality, and he claims that the Christians who were left in Jerusalem, when the revolt first began, in other words, when the Jews began to become very militarily aggressive towards Rome, that they understood that as some of the signs of the last time, and that they left Jerusalem, and most of them went to a city called Pella, which was on the other side of the Jordan River. It's at the bottom of the Transjordanian Mountains. He says that this was actually where Jesus was referencing when he told them to flee to the mountains. He was talking about this area of the Decapolis. I want you to go to the mountains. And that terminology would have referenced this particular part. Don't know if that's true or not. But what also is interesting is that near Pella, up in those mountains, they have discovered numerous caves where Christians can be identified as living when the Roman persecution went against Christians. So there was a large Christian population at Pella. Whether they all came from Jerusalem or whatever, we could wonder about. But the accuracy of Jesus' prophecy concerning Jerusalem is amazing. And it becomes evidence that the instructions he's going to give about the end time are just as precise. In other words, when we can look historically at this thing happening just the way Jesus said it was going to happen, and we can look at amazement with the truthfulness of that event, we can likewise know that the rest of what Jesus is going to teach in this environment is just as accurate, just as truthful. The challenge then is to likewise be prepared for the end times. And that's exactly where Jesus is going to go. He has had this monumental confrontation with the hypocritical Jews. Now his disciples are asking him about the destruction of that whole system. And he's given them information, but he wants them to have a message. And I think it's really important that we notice Jesus is switching crowds. He is no longer talking in the temple. He's no longer talking to the Jewish leaders. He's now talking to people who are his followers. In other words, he is issuing to them a warning. Guess what? You can become just like that. You can become as hypocritical. You can be distracted by all of the same issues that they were distracted by. And so Christ is going to issue to his followers warnings, and he's going to do it in two parables. And the first one is this parable of the 10 virgins, and Dylan read that for us a few moments ago, so we won't go through it again. But let's just look at some of the things we should understand from that. First of all, we've got the bridegroom, and that's going to represent Christ. He's coming. He's coming back, but nobody knows when. And then that the parable describes his return. And the point is, he's been telling the disciples, I'm leaving. He's told them earlier in the week, I'm not going to be here. You know, the light is going to be gone. Darkness will come. There is great accuracy in the marriage customs of that day. Expositor's Bible commentary talks about the normal procedure for weddings. The bridegroom come with some close friends, left his home to go to the bride's home, and where there were various ceremonies followed by a procession through the streets. That would happen after nightfall, and they would go to his home. The 10 virgins may be bridesmaids who have been assisting the bride. They've expected to meet the groom as he comes from the bride's house. Everyone in the procession was expected to carry his or her own torch. If you will, it was like your invitation. If you didn't have a torch, then you must be a wedding crasher, and you don't belong here. So everybody was expected. This was the custom. You had a torch, and it was lit, so you were a part of those that were invited to this festival. These festivities, which might last several days, would formally get underway at the groom's house. That's the situation that this parable describes, waiting for the groom to come. And the point of it all is you need to be ready, because as the groom, I'm coming. I'm coming back. So here's Jesus with the disciples, and he's saying, I'm leaving, but you need to be prepared. You need to be ready because I'm coming back. Those wise represent those who live with anticipation and eagerness regarding the Lord's return. Their readiness is evidenced within their love, their obedience, and their service. Those who were not ready are identified. Jesus identifies them in the parable as they were the foolish. They were foolish. And the reason they're identified as foolish is because their lives were characterized by a lack of love, by a lack of obedience, and by a lack of service. So again, Jesus comes right back to the same issue he was addressing to the Jewish leaders, and there has to be this realness of serving God. There has to be the mercy and the love along with the tithing of all the various herbs and spices. It's got to be the whole package. You can't step away. And then Jesus uses another parable, the parable of the talents, and we will read through this, beginning in Matthew 25, verse 14. For it will be like a man going on a journey, who called his servants and entrusted to them his property. To one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, to another 1, to each according to his ability. Then he went away. He who had received the 5 talents went at once and traded with them, and he made 5 talents more. So also he who had the 2 talents made 2 talents more. But he who had received the 1 talent went and dug in the ground, and he hid his master's money. Now after a long time the master of those servants came and settled accounts with them. And he who had received the 5 talents came forward, bringing 5 talents more, saying, Master, you delivered to me 5 talents. Here, I have made 5 talents more. And his master said to him, Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful over a little. I will set you over much. Enter into the joy of your master. And he also, who had the 2 talents, came forward, saying, Master, you delivered to me 2 talents. Here, I have made 2 talents more. And his master said to him, Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful over little. I will set you over much. Enter into the joys of your master. And also, he who had received the 1 talent came forward, saying, Master, I knew you to be a hard man, reaping where you did not sow, and gathering where you had scattered no seed. So I was afraid. And I went and I hid your talent in the ground. Here you have what is yours. But his master answered him, You wicked and slothful servant. You knew that I reap where I do not sow, and I gather where I scattered no seed. Then you ought to have invested my money with the bankers, and at my coming I should have received what was my own with interest. So take the talent from him, give it to him who has 10 talents. For to everyone who has, more will be given, and he will have an abundance. But from the one who has not, even what he has will be taken away. And cast the worthless servant into the outer darkness. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Keep in mind, this is not a parable to the hypocritical Jewish leaders. Jesus is giving this parable to his group of disciples who have said, what are things going to be like at the end? And Jesus has told them, it's going to be like this. I'm leaving. Don't know when I'm coming back. No man knows when that time will be. Because I'm going to impart, I'm going to delegate to you responsibilities as my servants, as my stewards, and you will be in charge of what I have. And I will give it to each one of you. Those responsibilities will be given to you in accord with your individual abilities. Isn't it interesting that Jesus has already said to Peter that he's going to give him the keys of the kingdom? I suspect Peter must have been the 5-talent guy. He says, I'm going to distribute according to each of your abilities. Those spiritual responsibilities can grow when controlled by faith and fervor. In other words, I'm going to leave you with responsibility, and I'm going to give you abilities, talents, and I expect you to use those. I expect you to invest those. And if you do, your amount will grow. Your abilities will grow. Spiritual responsibilities, however, will die when they're controlled by fear. Even what the master gives, the gift from the master, will be of no value when people are controlled by fear. And then judgment will be individual. One of the things I get from this is, folks, the church is not responsible for how I use my abilities. I'm responsible. Hence, when we get to the book of Revelation, isn't it the church at Sardis where it says there are some who have not soiled their garments? There were some who were still investing what they were responsible to do within an environment of corruption. Folks, this is not an issue of the church. This is an issue of individuals. And Jesus says, individually, you are gifted by me as your master, and I gift you according to your abilities, and you had better be using it. That's what he's teaching. And folks, that's just as true as the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. So the point, be ready because you are responsible. Two parables holding the same message. I'm leaving, but I'm coming back. I need for you to be ready. Why be ready? Try to picture where the mind of the disciples would have been. They have just heard Jesus judge the Jewish leaders. He has just condemned them as deity. He has judged motives, hearts, not just actions. He's not just been a fruit inspector. He has done what only God can do. And the disciples have witnessed all of that. They have witnessed those men walking away in silence as they're unable to address because they know that what Jesus, his judgment is accurate. His judgment is true. Jesus is the judge. And now he's going to say, you know what? I just don't judge them. I also am going to judge you. And so, Tuesday message continues. And towards the end of this conversation on the Mount of Olives, Jesus puts forth the portrait of himself as judge over those that follow him. And here's what the text says. When the Son of Man comes in his glory and all his angels with him, then he will sit on his glorious throne. Before him will be gathered all nations, and he will separate people from one another as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. And he will place the sheep on the right, but the goats on the left. And then the king will say to those on his right, come, you who are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you visited me. I was in prison, and you came to me. And the righteous will answer him, saying, Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you drink? And when did we see you a stranger and welcome you, or naked and clothe you? And when did we see you sick or in prison and visit you? And the king will answer, truly I say to you that you did, as you did it to one of the least of these my brothers, you did it to me. Then he will say to those on his left, depart from me, you cursed, into eternal fire, prepared for the devil and his angels. For I was hungry, and you gave me no food. I was thirsty, and you gave me no drink. I was a stranger, and you did not welcome me, naked, and you did not clothe me, sick and in prison, and you did not visit me. Then they will answer, saying, Lord, when did we see you hungry or thirsty or a stranger or naked or sick or in prison, and did not minister to you? And then he will answer to them, truly I say to you, as you did not do it to one of these least of these, you did not do it to me. Jesus lets his followers know, I'm going to judge you. I not only judge the Jews for their spiritual hypocrisy and their departure, but I will judge you. And you know, folks, he's not talking, that text is not talking, it's not in the context, nor does it even indicate that it's talking about a division between Christian and heathen sinner. It's talking about people who call Jesus Lord. And it says, there are some of you calling me Lord, but you're not doing the things that followers of me would do. So, Jesus would ask us today a couple of questions. I think he would ask, first of all, are you ready? Are you ready? We have learned in the last couple of weeks of the uncertainties of life. We've had a bold illustration. We can have many years, we can have none, and our life is still fragile. Are you ready? Where is your belief? Belief in Christ. Do you need him as your master? Where's the actions of your life? Are you penitent over things that are sinful in your life? Are you willing to confess Jesus? Are you willing to die and be buried with him and to experience the similar resurrection? Where are you? Are you ready? And then, especially if we've done those things, then the next question that would come from Christ is, are you fulfilling your responsibilities? are you fulfilling your responsibilities? Jesus made it very plain. This is an issue of individual significance. We can debate all day, the weaknesses and the fallacies and the ways of improving us as a body, and those exist. Those are realities. But that's not how we're going to be judged. We're going to be judged as individuals. And you know what happens when we as individuals begin to live like we are going to be judged? Is we affect the whole. It's interesting that in Ephesians chapter 4, it is not the church that grows itself. It is the individual members who, when they are equipped for their works of service, that they cause the building up of the body of Christ. We think backwards sometimes. So, are you fulfilling your responsibilities with the gifts, the talents that God has invested you with? And then lastly, how do we think Jesus will view us in judgment? This is the flip coin of what Chris went through in class this morning. We know if we're in Christ, we have salvation. But part of the knowledge of knowing that we're in Christ is knowing that we're being obedient. Not perfect, but we're being as obedient as we can be. And that's some of what gives us our confidence. How will Jesus judge me? As I was working on my lesson and saw that Kyle was song leader, I said, don't do this very often, but Kyle, there's a song that would really work well. And I said, it's not in our projection, but I'll make it for projection if you're willing to lead it. And he said he was, so thank you, Kyle. But there is a great day coming. And folks, we need to know that it is just as certain as the troops marching into Jerusalem in 70 AD. It's just as certain as that event in history. Jesus is coming back. He's coming back. Now, we may be alive when that happens. We may not be alive. But Christ is going to return. And there's going to be a judgment. And Jesus is going to judge those who claim to be his, just like he pronounced judgment on those who claim to be gods in the temple in Jerusalem just 3 days before they kill him. Are we ready? There is a great day coming. If you have any doubts about being ready, this would be a great day to take away the doubt. Take away the doubt. You need to become a child of God. You need to correct something that's amiss in your life. Feel like you need the prayers of the church. You need to go home and find your closet and get things worked out with the Father. Whatever you need to do, this would be a great day to do that, because there is a great day and it's coming.